In 2022, Boris Johnson came to Kyiv to support Ukraine and said a phrase that became a real meme. Good afternoon, everybody. It was Johnson who became one of those who helped seal the UK's exit from the European Union. This is a country that is used to winning, the sixth largest economy in the world by nominal GDP, with nearly $4 trillion in 2025 surpassing France, Italy, and Russia. One of the world's key financial centers with the London Stock Exchange, which is one of the oldest and largest stock exchanges in Europe. Britain is home to leading universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. The country has a global influence shaped over centuries. From building the largest empire in history, the British Empire, through the Industrial Revolution and dominance at sea, to shaping the modern system of international relations, spreading English law and democratic institutions. It's like a top football club, like Manchester City or Liverpool, who have played at a high tempo for years and consistently gotten results. But even the strongest teams can lose if they focus on short-term solutions instead of the long run. It may look impressive, but it's not necessarily effective. In this analogy, Brexit is like a team that controls the ball, leads the game, but suddenly changes tactics and leaves the tournament it had every chance to win. And this story isn't about a sudden failure. Britain didn't collapse, but it started to gradually lose its position. Less investment, more complicated trade, more uncertainty. Was this really a choice in favor of strength? Or, on the contrary, a step that limited the country's opportunities? The decision for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union happened when politics began to dominate over economic logic. The question is whether one of the world's strongest economies can afford such a step without disastrous long-term consequences. Friends, we have an ambitious goal to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You may have been watching us for a long time and might not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your relatives and friends about it. Also, give us a like and leave a comment under this video. We thank all our donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every contribution you make brings Ukraine closer to economic prosperity and well-being. After all, we are not just making videos, but informing voters who will choose real reformers. Help us. The link to support Tsina Derzavi is in the description. The United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community in 1973. This decision was a response to the gradual economic lag behind the countries of continental Europe, particularly the decline in real GDP per capita compared to other states. In 1960, the United Kingdom had $13,780 per capita, which was higher than in France and Germany. However, by 1973, the situation had changed. Germany caught up with the United Kingdom, and France surpassed it. When it comes to trade, the British economy used to be oriented not so much toward Europe, but rather toward the global Commonwealth. Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, and South Africa. In the 1960s, only about 21% of exports were directed to European countries, while the key partners were mainly non-European countries: the United States, Australia, Canada, South Africa, India, and New Zealand, which accounted for 33% of exports. At the same time, by 1970, the structure had already begun to change. The share of European partners increased to 30%, indicating a gradual but systematic reorientation of the British economy toward the European market even before the official accession to the EU. At the same time, in the second half of the 20th century, Great Britain began to lose its position relative to the leading economies of continental Europe. By the end of the 1960s, France, West Germany, and Italy had already surpassed it in terms of GDP per capita. Moreover, the gap only continued to grow. Between 1958 and 1973, these countries nearly doubled their figures. A 95% increase compared to a 50% increase in Britain. Britain's economic lag was evident not only in growth rates, but also in the structure of its economy. British industry was losing its position in global production. If in the 1870s, Great Britain accounted for about 22.9% of global industrial production, by 1973, this figure had dropped to 4.9%. It was against this background that the British political elite began to view integration into the EU as a tool for modernizing the economy and overcoming economic lag. The first attempt to join was made by the government of Harold Macmillan in July 1961. However, the President of France, Charles de Gaulle, blocked the United Kingdom's entry twice, in 1963 and 1967. He argued this was due to incompatible economic interests and concerns that the country would become a conduit for US influence in Europe. The Tsina Derzavi channel features a video on the French economy and Charles de Gaulle's policies. France's decline. Socialism and populism stole prosperity. Only after de Gaulle's resignation in 1969 were the negotiations resumed. And in 1973, the government of Prime Minister Edward Heath completed the process of the United Kingdom joining the EU. By the time of accession, economic ties were already significant. By the late 1960s, about 21 to 22% of the United Kingdom's goods exports went to the 6 EU countries. In the future, this dependence will increase significantly. If in the 1980s, the EU's share in British exports was about 50%, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, it had risen to almost 60%. After joining the EU, imports from member countries rose to 50% and remained at that level. This made the European Union the largest trading partner of the United Kingdom. In monetary terms, these figures were even more significant. In 2015, British exports to EU countries amounted to approximately 306.4 billion euros, while imports from the European Union were over 400 billion euros. Membership in the European Economic Community also contributed to the growth of foreign investment in the British economy. Yes, since joining, the share of investments as a percentage of GDP began to steadily increase, from 0.7 in 1972 to almost 10 at its peak in 2000 and 2005. On average, it exceeded the level of 2.5 over the 50 years after joining. In monetary terms, over these same 50 years, Britain received $2 trillion in direct foreign investments, calculated in current US dollars. In 2014, foreign companies provided 14% of employment in the private sector, of which 7% of that employment came from companies from the European Union. Access to the single European market made Great Britain one of the key platforms for transnational corporations, which used the country as a base for operations throughout Europe. In particular, Honda, which invested in its plants in Swindon, or Nissan in Sunderland, Toyota in Burnaston and Deeside. The financial sector played a particularly significant role in this process. London gradually turned into one of the main financial centers of the world, through which in 2019, more than 40% of international currency trading passed. However, economic integration did not mean complete political integration. Just 2 years after joining the European Community, a 1975 referendum was held in the United Kingdom to confirm its membership. Its holding was connected to the domestic political situation. The Labour Party government, led by Harold Wilson, promised to review the terms of membership in the EEC during the 1974 election campaign, and to put this issue to a nationwide vote in order to resolve the deep divisions within the parties and society. As a result, 67.2% of voters voted to remain in membership, against 32.8%. In the 1980s, tensions became especially pronounced during the premiership of Margaret Thatcher. Although she supported the creation of a single European market, which was officially completed in 1999, at the same time, she opposed deeper political integration and the centralization of power within the EU. The most vivid manifestation of this position was the budget dispute between the United Kingdom and the Community. which arose because the country was one of the largest contributors to its budget, but received relatively less funding. In response, Margaret Thatcher demanded a review of the financial terms of participation, which was symbolically phrased as, "I want my money back." The culmination of this conflict was the European Council Summit in Fontainebleau, France, in June 1984, where a compromise was reached. The United Kingdom received a budget rebate mechanism, known as the British rebate, which provided for the return of approximately 66% of the difference between the country's contributions to the EU budget and the funds it received from it. This special position of the United Kingdom's rebate was evident during the negotiations and signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, when John Major's government effectively set conditions for participation in the new stage of integration. The treaty provided for the creation of the European Union and the launch of the Economic and Monetary Union with a transition to a single currency, which raised concerns in the British government about losing control over national monetary policy. As a result of the negotiations, Britain managed to include a special protocol that gave it the right not to adopt the euro, which became one of the conditions for ratifying the treaty. It also received an opt-out from the social protocol, which regulated labor and social standards. At the same time, John Major's government also secured a number of other exemptions. In particular, the United Kingdom did not join the Schengen area, retaining control over its own borders, and introduced a flexible opt-in, opt-out mechanism in the area of freedom, security, and justice. Later, Tony Blair's government, together with Poland, secured a special protocol on the limited application of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which ultimately established a unique model of partial integration. The country actively participated in the single market, but distanced itself from the key political institutions of the European Union. At the beginning of the 21st century, new factors were added to these contradictions. After the EU enlargement in 2004, the United Kingdom opened its labor market to citizens of Central and Eastern European countries, which led to a sharp increase in labor migration. In just the first years after the enlargement, more than 765,000 workers from the new member countries registered to work in the United Kingdom. At the same time, net migration, the difference between the number of people who arrived in the country and those who left, remained steadily at the level of 150,000 to 300,000 people per year in the mid-2000s. At the same time, the country's economy was becoming increasingly uneven. London grew into a powerful global financial hub. By 2016, about 37% of all currency transactions in the world went through it, which effectively secured the city's leading role in international finance. London and the southeast of the country had already formed the economic core of Great Britain by the time of Brexit, while regional disparities were systemic. According to ONS data, in 2015, the gross value added, that is, the difference between the value of goods and services produced and the cost of intermediate raw materials and supplies, in London was €60,107 per capita, whereas in many regions of northern England and the Midlands, it was about €27,380 to €27,538. And this inequality was directly reflected in fiscal flows. In 2015-2016, London had a net surplus of about €36.5 billion, whereas most other regions, particularly the Northwest, Yorkshire, and the Midlands, showed significant deficits. Economic imbalances were also evident in labor productivity. In 2014, it was about 3.7%, lower than in France, and about 2.3% lower than in Germany. The gap, of course, has narrowed since joining the EU, but it still remains. Thus, the United Kingdom's membership in the EU combined tangible economic benefits: increased trade, significant inflow of investments, and the strengthening of London's financial role. At the same time, there were ongoing political debates about how deep the integration should be. It was this internal tension that ultimately led the country to the decision to leave the EU. The run-up to the referendum on the UK's continued membership in the EU was one of the most polarized periods in its modern history. The campaign leading up to the June 23, 2016 vote exposed deep economic, social, and political divisions within the country. The debates quickly moved beyond economics and turned into a broader conflict about sovereignty, migration, inequality, trust in the elite, and Britain's place in the world. In these circumstances, the campaign ahead of the referendum split into two major camps: Leave and Remain, which offered fundamentally different visions for the country's economic and political future. The active phase began in February 2016 after the official announcement of the referendum date by the government led by David Cameron. Although the groundwork had been taking shape since 2013, when Cameron promised to hold a referendum under Eurosceptic pressure. The Remain camp was institutionally organized through the campaign Breathing Stronger in Europe, a human rights group that promoted the idea of the United Kingdom remaining in the EU, was established in October 2015 and was supported by Prime Minister David Cameron. At the same time, the Leave camp consolidated around the organization World Leave, which was also established in October 2015. The key political figures of this organization at that time were the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, and the Secretary of State for Justice, Michael Gove. Also, the leader of the nationalist UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage, played an important role as one of the main representatives of the Eurosceptic movement. Supporters of leaving the EU built their arguments around the idea of regaining control over key areas of national policy, with the central slogan of the campaign being the phrase, "Take back control." It was created by the campaign strategist Dominic Cummings. Later, he became the chief advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson. One of the strongest and at the same time most controversial arguments of the Leave campaign was the claim about the United Kingdom's financial contributions to the EU budget. Voters were regularly told that the country supposedly pays €482 million every week, and this money could have been directed to fund the National Health Service. This exact amount even appeared on the campaign bus. However, if you look at the actual data for the same period, the picture looks different. In 2015, after taking into account the rebate and the funds the country received back through various EU programs, the net contribution was approximately €151.5 million per week, or about €7.9 billion per year. Much less than what appeared in political rhetoric. At the same time, the United Kingdom was receiving significant financial transfers from the EU budget. In total, about €6 to €7 billion per year through agricultural, regional, and scientific programs. According to the European Commission, only within the framework of direct and partially indirect programs, in 2015 British beneficiaries received about €6 billion. For comparison, the total expenditure on the healthcare system in the United Kingdom in 2015 amounted to about €254 billion, of which more than €202 billion were funded by the government. The financial balance of relations between London and Brussels was more complex and less negative than it was presented during political campaigns. It was a partnership with mutual benefit, not a one-sided loss of funds. The arguments of the Leave supporters were also based on broader historical and cultural narratives. The image of Great Britain as a global power with a special historical role in world politics was often used. In turn, the Remain campaign based its arguments primarily on the economic risks of leaving the European Union. Supporters of membership emphasized that participation in the single European market provides British companies with access to the largest integrated market in the world, with about 445 million consumers, which promotes trade, attracts investment, and creates jobs. Many international economic organizations, including the IMF, the World Bank, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, warned about the potential negative economic consequences of the United Kingdom leaving the EU. In particular, according to estimates by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Brexit could have led to a decrease in the UK's GDP by more than 3% in the short term compared to the scenario of remaining in the EU, and by more than 5% in the long term. Additionally, forecast models showed a possible reduction in exports by about 6% and imports by nearly 8% in the event of leaving the single market. The Brexit campaign also saw significant national and societal mobilization. Mass demonstrations were held in various cities across the United Kingdom by both supporters and opponents of leaving the European Union. Numerous actions and political events took place, including rallies and even attempts at mass events like the Brexit Festival in Birmingham. There were also broader public initiatives in support of unity with the EU, such as the Hack a Breed Hug, a Brit campaign, which gained significant traction on social networks and in the media. Many major British and international campaigns openly advocated for remaining in the European Union. Among them were oil and gas company Shell, telecommunications company Vodafone, banking group HSBC, as well as more than 1,200 business leaders, including representatives from about 50 companies. The FTSE 100 Index, the index of the 100 largest companies by market capitalization on the London Stock Exchange. And well-known business leaders like Richard Branson have publicly stated that Brexit could lead to a decrease in investment, trade, and employment. The referendum on the United Kingdom's membership in the European Union took place on June 23, 2016. More than 33.5 million voters participated in the vote, which is over 72%. This was one of the highest turnout rates in British nationwide votes in recent decades. According to the results of the referendum, 17.4 million voters, which is 51.9%, supported leaving the European Union. Meanwhile, 16.1 million voters, which is 48.1%, voted to remain in the European Union. Despite the relatively small difference in the nationwide result, the geography of the voting showed a deep territorial divide in the country. The greatest support for EU membership was shown in London, where almost 60% of voters voted to remain in the EU. And in Scotland, where the support was even higher, 62% of voters voted to remain in the EU. At the same time, a significant part of England, especially the post-industrial regions, voted to leave the EU. For example, in the West Midlands region, 59.3% of voters voted to leave, and in Yorkshire and the Humber, 57.7%. The regions that suffered the most: Yorkshire and the Humber, 57.7%. 57.7% Yorkshire and the Humber, 57.7%. Meanwhile, large cities and regions with a high concentration of high-tech sectors and financial services showed more pro-European attitudes. Formally, the United Kingdom left the EU on January 31, 2020. However, during the transition period, the country continued to operate under the rules of the single market. The full economic exit from the European regulatory system took place on January 1, 2021, when the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union came into effect. One of the most significant economic effects of Brexit was a sharp increase in investment uncertainty. By 2025, the level of business investment in the United Kingdom was 12 to 18% lower than in the hypothetical scenario if Brexit had not happened. In addition, according to the World Bank, the inflow of foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP decreased from 12 in 2016 to -0.4 in 2020 to 2024. In monetary terms, this reflected a change from $324 billion in 2016 to an outflow of $13 billion in 2024. Also, in 2025, GDP per capita was 6.8% lower than it could have been in an alternative scenario without Brexit. This decline in investment had direct macroeconomic consequences. One of the key mechanisms of this impact was the transformation of foreign trade. Although the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the United Kingdom and the EU allowed zero tariffs to be maintained for most goods, companies were forced to adapt to new customs procedures, certification requirements, and checks on the origin of goods. According to the British government body, the Office for Budget Responsibility, as a result of these changes, the United Kingdom's trade intensity also changed. In the long term, exports and imports will be about 15% lower than if the United Kingdom had remained in the EU. Despite attempts to diversify foreign trade by signing new trade agreements with other countries, including Japan in 2019 and Australia in 2021, the European Union remains the main trading partner of the United Kingdom. In 2024, British exports of goods and services to EU countries amounted to approximately €422.8 billion, or about 41% of the country's total exports. Meanwhile, imports from the European Union amounted to €536.2 billion, which is approximately 51% of all imported supplies to the United Kingdom. In some sectors of the economy, the consequences of Brexit have been particularly acute. Exports of agricultural products to the EU have decreased by about 37% over 5 years after the full Brexit, compared to 2019. Major changes have occurred in the financial sector, a key driver of the British economy. Before Brexit, London held leading positions in the European financial services market, particularly thanks to the passporting rights mechanism. This system allowed banks and financial companies licensed in the United Kingdom to operate freely throughout the entire EU, without the need to obtain separate permits in each country. After leaving the EU, this mechanism stopped working, which forced many international banks to move their offices or subsidiaries to the EU. As of 2021, 440 financial firms left the United Kingdom, and the total volume of relocated assets amounted to over €1 trillion. Brexit also affected labor productivity. For example, the long-term forecasts of the British Office for Budget Responsibility. They predict that as a result of Brexit, labor productivity will be 4% lower than it could have been without Brexit. A separate challenge for the British economy was the transformation of the labor market after the end of free movement between the United Kingdom and the EU. After Brexit, the number of low-skilled workers from EU countries decreased significantly, which caused a labor shortage in several sectors of the economy. Overall employment was 3 to 4% below its potential level. These problems were especially acute in agriculture, the hotel and restaurant sector, and the transport and logistics sphere. For example, the shortage of truck drivers in 2021 was estimated at over 100,000 people. The labor shortage in the meat processing industry became so severe that 120,000 pigs were not processed due to the lack of necessary personnel. Brexit has added new administrative costs and regulations for small and medium-sized businesses. Companies that previously traded with European Union countries without customs procedures were forced, after 2021, to file customs declarations, comply with rules of origin, and undergo sanitary and technical inspections. For many small businesses, these procedures required additional financial expenses. The number of customs forms has quadrupled since Brexit, resulting in an additional €8.6 billion. According to the Economic Freedom Index from the Canadian think tank Fraser Institute, the United Kingdom dropped from 8th place in 2021 to 13th place in 2023. On one hand, after Brexit, the United Kingdom did gain greater autonomy in shaping its own trade policy and the ability to sign new international trade agreements, which met the expectations of supporters of the Leave campaign. On the other hand, leaving the single European market led to the emergence of new trade barriers, a decrease in investment activity, and problems with labor productivity. The United Kingdom's exit from the European Union was not only an economic and geopolitical turning point, but also caused deep political turbulence both in its relations with the EU and within the United Kingdom itself. Brexit posed the difficult task of formulating a new system of political, economic, and legal interaction with the EU, while at the same time maintaining internal political stability and the unity of the country. In the first years after leaving the EU, these processes were accompanied by sharp political conflicts and complex negotiations. The key instrument for regulating the new relations between the United Kingdom and the European Union became the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which came into force on January 1, 2021. The document became the foundation of the new system of economic and political relations between the parties after the United Kingdom's membership in the EU ended. The agreement contains over 1,200 pages and covers a wide range of areas of cooperation, including trade in goods, transport, energy, fisheries, the digital economy, judicial cooperation, and coordination in the field of security. One of the key features of the agreement was the preservation of duty-free and quota-free trade in goods between the United Kingdom and the European Union. However, unlike during the period of EU membership, British companies no longer have automatic access to the single European market. In particular, due to leaving the EU customs union, the systems that ensured the free movement of goods without customs procedures effectively made the EU one of the world's largest trading giants. We have a video about this in more detail. The secret of the EU's wealth: how a single customs system made Europe a trading giant. To receive tariff preferences, goods must comply with rules of origin, which significantly complicates trade operations for businesses. The agreement only partially covers the services sector, which is key for the British economy, since the services sector accounts for about 80% of economic output and about 46% of the United Kingdom's exports. In particular, the largest contribution to gross value added comes from public services, healthcare, and education, making up about 19% of the economy, as well as trade, transport, and tourism at 16%, real estate operations at almost 14%, and professional and business services, including consulting and IT, at over 13%. As a result, many service companies have faced new barriers when operating in the European Union market, including the need to obtain work permits, recognition of professional qualifications, and compliance with regulatory requirements in EU countries. One of the most difficult political issues after Brexit has been the question of Northern Ireland. The peculiarity of this region is that it has a land border with the Republic of Ireland, a member state of the European Union. After the United Kingdom left the customs union and the single market, there was a threat of a hard border appearing on the island of Ireland, which could jeopardize the peace process established by the 1998 Belfast Agreement. To avoid this scenario, within the withdrawal agreement, the Northern Ireland Protocol was created, a special mechanism that provides Northern Ireland with continued access to the European Union single market for goods. As a result, actual customs and regulatory controls were moved to the Irish Sea, which means the introduction of trade checks between the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. This decision made it possible to avoid creating a physical border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland, an independent state. However, some political forces in Northern Ireland, particularly the Unionist parties, opposed the new trade regime, believing that it effectively separates the region from the economic space of the United Kingdom. Political disputes surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol continued for several years and became one of the main sources of tension in relations between London and Brussels. In 2023, the government of the United Kingdom and the EU reached a new compromise known as the Windsor Framework, which provides for the simplification of customs procedures for goods moving between the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. Brexit also had serious consequences for the internal unity of the United Kingdom. This issue became especially acute in Scotland, where the majority of voters during the 2016 referendum supported remaining in the EU. Political forces in Scotland, particularly the Scottish National Party, which was initially led by Alex Salmond and, after the referendum, by Nicola Sturgeon, began to actively use Brexit as an argument in favour of a second independence referendum. The first referendum on Scotland's independence took place on September 18, 2014, in which 55.3% of voters voted against independence. The idea of a second referendum became an important element of the political agenda in Scottish politics in the years following the United Kingdom's exit from the EU. Despite repeated attempts by the Scottish government to hold a second referendum, including aiming for 2023, it has not taken place due to the lack of agreement from the UK government and the legal limitations on the powers of the Scottish Parliament to organise such a vote. Meanwhile, Brexit created major political instability within the central government. After the 2016 referendum, Prime Minister David Cameron resigned. His successor was Theresa May, who led the government in 2016 and began a complicated process, negotiations on the UK's exit from the EU, as it was necessary to agree on the terms, future trade relations, and the status of the Irish border at the same time. The attempts of Theresa May's government to ratify the Brexit agreement in the British Parliament faced political resistance for a long time. The main problem was that no Brexit option had a stable majority in Parliament. Theresa May's agreement was rejected by MPs 3 times, both by supporters of a hard Brexit and its opponents, which led to a prolonged parliamentary crisis. In 2019, May also resigned, and her successor was Boris Johnson, who came to power under the slogan, "Get Brexit Done." He brought the UK's official exit from the EU to its logical conclusion. After Boris Johnson's resignation in 2022, which was caused by a series of political scandals and mass resignations of government members, in particular, more than 50 officials left, the new Prime Minister became Liz Truss, whose government lasted only 6 weeks, one of the shortest terms in British political history. Was this related to the economic crisis? After the announcement of a large-scale package of unfunded tax breaks worth 52 billion euros, which caused instability in the financial markets and a drop in the pound sterling to 0.86 pounds per US dollar. At the beginning of September 2022, it dropped to 0.91, and in mid-2022 to 0.91% inside 2021. After that, the position of Prime Minister was taken by Rishi Sunak. In 2024, after the defeat of the Conservative Party in the general elections, which traditionally supports the ideas of a market economy, limiting government intervention, stricter migration policy, and an emphasis on national sovereignty, Rishi Sunak resigned, and the new Prime Minister became Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, which it emphasized the welfare state, a more active role of the government in the economy, and a more open approach to international cooperation. This marked the end of a 14-year period of conservative rule, which was characterized by constant political instability and the change of 6 prime ministers in a short time. The issue of migration, which was one of the central arguments of Brexit supporters and was associated with the intention to limit the influx of cheap labor from EU countries, took on a new form after the United Kingdom left the European Union. Although net migration from EU countries did indeed decrease, the overall migration flow to the country increased significantly due to the influx of citizens from other countries. In 2023, it reached a record level of almost 1 million people per year. At the same time, the level of public support for Brexit has significantly decreased compared to the results of the 2016 referendum, when 52% of voters voted to leave the EU. According to YouGov polls conducted in 2025, only 30% of Britons consider the decision to leave to be correct, while 55% see it as a mistake. In our videos, we often mention a phenomenon known as high net worth individual migration. These are people whose investment assets exceed $1 million. These are the most valuable people who invest in the economy and ensure its development. The movement of such wealthy individuals around the world is one of the indicators of a country's attractiveness. Because of Brexit, Britain has become one of the world leaders in terms of high net worth individuals leaving the country along with their capital. In 2022, 1,500 people left the country, and the United Kingdom entered the top 10 countries losing people in this category. A year later, the number of wealthy immigrants doubled. Already 3,200 people have left the island. In 2024, the number has already tripled. 9,500 high net worth individuals have left the country. And in 2025, Britain became the absolute world leader. Approximately, the combined wealth of millionaire migrants amounted to $91.8 billion. For comparison, China, which took second place in the list of countries from which the wealthy are leaving, saw people worth almost $60 billion move to more attractive countries. Or Russia, which launched a full-scale war against Ukraine and is under the largest number of sanctions in the world, lost millionaires with a total wealth of $14.7 billion. This once again highlights what a global problem Brexit has become for the United Kingdom. Brexit was often presented as a historic opportunity for the United Kingdom, a chance to take back control, independently determine economic policy, and build new global connections. But if you look at the results objectively, without political rhetoric, it becomes clear that this decision has brought significantly more economic and structural problems than the expected benefits. Leaving the world's largest integrated market turned out not to be a liberation, but a break in a complex system of connections that had shaped competitiveness for decades. The UK economy after Brexit faced a number of cumulative effects, from a decrease in investments to the loss of part of its trade flows. And this is not about a sharp collapse, but about a gradual decline where the country doesn't fall, but consistently lags behind the scenario in which it would have remained in the EU. Trade has become one of the most striking examples. Formally, access to the market has been preserved, but new barriers have made it harder for businesses to operate, and some companies have reduced their presence in the internal market or moved their activities elsewhere. At the same time, the labor market has changed. Migration restrictions have not reduced the demand for labor, but they have created imbalances. And the overall level of migration has even increased, which contradicts one of the key promises of Brexit. Attempts to compensate for losses through new trade agreements are part of diversification, not a full replacement for the European market. Geography, logistics, and already established economic ties mean that the EU has remained, is, and will continue to be a key partner for Britain. And no new agreement so far is able to change this structure in the short or medium term. In a broader sense, Brexit became an example of how political decisions can contradict economic logic. Leaving an integrated system does not automatically mean strengthening sovereignty. It often means losing access to resources, markets, and opportunities. Therefore, if you look at the result honestly, without ideology, Brexit is not a story about an economic breakthrough. It's a story about the price of disintegration. And at the moment, this price for the United Kingdom looks much higher than the benefits that were expected during the referendum. Write in the comments what you think. Were the economic benefits of Brexit for Britain significant enough to offset the losses from leaving the largest market in the world?
Thanks to Atlas Network for making this video possible. The author's views in this video don't necessarily reflect Atlas Network's opinions.